Scary telling.
I've always been a heavy drinker, so the morning after a night of heavy drinking was nothing new to me. However, what happened one night changed my perspective on what can happen when you drink too much. My friend and I were celebrating our reunion after a long time apart, and we were partying hard. We drank shots, mixed drinks, and beer, anything we could get our hands on. As the night went on, I started to feel the effects of the alcohol, but I kept drinking anyway. Maybe 2 hours into my alcohol-induced slumber, I'm lying on my back, my eyes suddenly ripped open, and I spew vomit into the air and somehow managed to turn my face to the side before it came back down so as to not get hit with a face full of vomit. I lay completely still for probably 2 to 3 minutes, trying to figure out what just happened and applauding myself for not waking my friend up. I got up, went to the bathroom, and cleaned myself up. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Later that night, I heard strange noises coming from the attic. It sounded like someone was walking around up there, but I knew that couldn't be possible since the attic was locked. Ignoring it, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The air was thick with an eerie silence, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noises kept getting louder. Suddenly, I heard my friend scream. I ran to her room and found her thrashing around on her bed, completely covered in vomit. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond. I called an ambulance, and they rushed her to the hospital. At the hospital, the doctors told me that they couldn't explain why she was in a coma-like state. She was in a critical condition, and they didn't know if she would survive. Days went by, and there was no change in her condition. I visited her every day, hoping and praying for her recovery. Then one night, while I was sitting alone in her room, I heard the noises again. This time they were coming from inside the room. I looked around and saw nothing, but the noises continued. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and I was trapped inside with whatever was making the noises. I could hear footsteps coming towards me, and I panicked. I tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. I started banging on the door and shouting for help, but no one came. Then I heard my friend's voice, but it wasn't her. It was distorted, like someone was mocking her voice. It said, "You shouldn't have come here." The footsteps got closer, and I knew that I had to act fast. I searched for something to use as a weapon and found a vase on the bedside table. As the footsteps reached the door, I braced myself and swung the vase as hard as I could. The door opened, and I stumbled outside. I ran to the nurse's station and told them what happened. They didn't believe me, but they checked the room anyway. They found nothing out of the ordinary, but my friend's condition started to improve. When I returned home, I tried to forget about what happened, but I couldn't. I started to have nightmares about the noises and the mocking voice. One night, I woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was the same figure I saw in my friend's room. It was wearing the same clothes and had the same distorted voice. I screamed and tried to run, but I was frozen in place. The figure slowly approached me, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. It said, "I warned you not to come back." That was the last thing I remembered before passing out. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me that I had been in a coma for several days and that my friend had died from her injuries. I was devastated and haunted by the memory of the figure in my room. I knew I had to do something about it, so I started to research about the house we were staying in. It turned out that the previous owner of the house had a daughter who died of alcohol poisoning. She was known to have haunted the house ever since. I realized that the midnight vomit incident had awakened her spirit, and she was angry. I decided to perform a cleansing ritual to rid the house of her presence. It was a risky move, but I had to do it. After the ritual, the house felt lighter, and the air was free of the previous tension. I never experienced anything paranormal again after that. However, I still remember the terror I felt that night and how it changed my life forever. Growing up, my mother always told me the story of the ghostly helper at the theater. It was a story that chilled me to the bone every time I heard it. But as I got older, I began to wonder if it was just a story, or if there was something more to it. My mother was a theater buff, and when she was pregnant with me, she would accompany my biological father to the local stage theater where he acted in various productions for rehearsals. One job she had taken on her own was to sit in various places in the house and take notes. She would sit in a few seats on different sides of the main level, including on the left side, right side, center, the row right behind the orchestra pit, and even in the very back row. She would go up into the balcony and sit in a few seats up there, and in some of the box seats on either side of the theater. One particular night, as rehearsal was starting to wrap up, my mother got up from her seat. As her feet were now hidden by her belly, it was difficult to see where she was walking, even more so since the lights in the house hadn't come up yet. Heading down a flight of stairs, she took a misstep and almost fell over when she felt somebody take a strong, firm grip on her upper arm and pull her back. She felt that same grip suddenly pull her forward, but very gently, and it never released until she got to the landing near the exit. She turned to thank the person who helped her down, but there was nobody there. She was alone in the theater. This incident left her puzzled and scared. She immediately told my biological father about it, and he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just her imagination. But over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Lights that had been turned off would suddenly turn on. Props that had been carefully placed on stage would be found in different locations. And my mother would occasionally feel that same grip on her arm, as if someone was trying to lead her somewhere. One day, my mother decided to investigate. She began to ask around about the history of the theater, and what she found was chilling. The theater had a long and sordid past. There had been several deaths over the years, from actors who had fallen from the catwalks to audience members who had suffered heart attacks during particularly frightening scenes. One of the deaths that stood out to her was that of a stagehand who had died in the early 1900s. He had been moving a heavy piece of scenery when it had fallen on top of him, crushing him to death. According to legend, his ghost still haunted the theater and would occasionally make himself known to the living. My mother began to wonder if the ghostly helper who had saved her from falling down the stairs was the same spirit. She continued to feel his presence around her, and she began to feel that he was trying to tell her something. One day, she decided to follow his lead, and he led her to a dusty old box in the basement of the theater. Inside the box, she found a set of notes that had been left there years before by a former theater critic. The notes were detailed and precise, and they contained valuable information about how the theater could be improved. My mother immediately passed the notes on to the director, who was amazed at the insight they contained. From that day on, the ghostly helper seemed to be at peace. He no longer haunted the theater, and my mother never felt his presence again. But the memory of the theater and the ghostly helper who had saved her from falling down the stairs stayed with her for the rest of her life. She continued to visit the theater and even became a volunteer, helping with productions and sharing her own experiences with other theatergoers. Years later, when my mother passed away, I inherited her love for the theater and her passion for the arts. One day, as I was walking through the old theater, I felt a familiar grip on my arm, and I knew it was the ghostly helper. But instead of feeling scared, I felt comforted, as if my mother's spirit was watching over me. From that day on, I felt a connection to the theater that I had never felt before. I knew that the ghostly helper was still there, guiding and protecting the theater and its visitors. And I knew that my mother was with me, too, sharing in my love for the arts and the memories of the theater that had brought us together. I was always a shy girl in high school, and I never had much luck with boys. But when I met him, I thought things would finally change. He was popular, good-looking, and seemed genuinely interested in me. We started dating, and after a few weeks, we finally had our first kiss. I was nervous, but I had done my research. I knew all about French kissing, and I was ready to impress him. I closed my eyes and leaned in, feeling his lips on mine. I slowly opened my mouth and started to spell out my name with my tongue, just like the articles on the internet had suggested. But then something strange happened. The boy started laughing. Not a quiet chuckle, but a loud, hysterical laugh that echoed through the empty hallway. He pulled away from me and ran down the hall, still laughing. I was left standing there, feeling embarrassed and confused. What had I done wrong? Was I a bad kisser? Did he not like me after all? I tried to forget about the incident and focus on our relationship. But things started to get strange after that. The boy would sometimes give me strange looks, as if he was hiding something. He would cancel our dates at the last minute, citing mysterious reasons. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him, asking him why he had laughed at me during our kiss. He seemed taken aback by my question and denied that he had ever laughed. But I knew what I had heard. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would hear someone laughing in the hallways when no one else was around. I started to see the boy's face in my dreams, his mouth twisted into a mocking grin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, I decided to do some investigating. I talked to some of the other students at school, trying to find out if they had heard anything strange about the boy. That's when I heard the rumors. According to some of the students, the boy had been involved in some kind of accident a few years ago. He had been driving too fast and had crashed his car, killing his girlfriend who was in the passenger seat. He had been so traumatized by the experience that he had started laughing uncontrollably whenever he was nervous or scared. I was horrified. Had I triggered this reaction by my awkward attempt at French kissing? Was I causing him to relive his trauma over and over again? I decided to talk to him one last time, hoping to find some closure. But when I saw him, I knew something was wrong. His eyes were wild and his mouth was twisted into a permanent grin. He started laughing, just like he had during our kiss. But this time, the laughter didn't stop. It just kept getting louder and louder until it filled the room. I ran out of the house, tears streaming down my face. I never saw the boy again after that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear his laughter echoing through the halls. Growing up in our family home was always normal, or so I thought. My mom would mention hearing someone walking up the stairs at night, but my dad, younger brother, and I never heard anything. However, my younger sister did, and she would often tell me about her experiences. We used to share a room, and she would tell me about feeling a presence sitting on her bed, tugging her duvet, and even scrabbling about underneath it. Our family dog would also react, growling and staring at a fixed spot in the room. These occurrences happened mostly while I was away from the house, but one incident took place while I was home. I had been studying and gone to bed early. My sister came into our room at bedtime and found me sitting bolt upright, staring directly at her with a huge, demonic grin on my face. She called my name twice, but I didn't respond or move, just continued staring. She quickly closed the door and reopened it, switching on the bedroom light to find me sleeping normally. Years later, I learned of this incident, and it sent chills down my spine. But that was just the beginning of the horrors that would unfold. One night, my sister and I were watching a horror movie in our living room when we heard a knock at the door. We opened it to find no one there. But as we closed the door, we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Thinking it was our parents, we called out, but there was no response. As we made our way upstairs, the footsteps grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone was running up the stairs, but when we reached the top, there was no one there. We searched the whole house, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made those footsteps. From that night on, things only got worse. My sister's experiences intensified, and she began to see things that I couldn't. She saw a tall, dark figure lurking in the corners of our rooms, watching us as we slept. She felt cold spots and heard strange noises that no one else could hear. One night, she woke up to find that her duvet was being pulled off of her bed. She tried to hold onto it, but it was like something was tugging it with great force. She screamed for her parents, but they didn't hear her. It was like she was trapped in a nightmare. But the most terrifying experience was yet to come. One night, my sister woke up to find the demonic grin on my face again, only this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I was sitting up in bed, staring at her with eyes that looked like they belonged to someone else. She tried to shake me awake, but I wouldn't budge. It was like I was possessed by something evil. She ran out of the room, screaming for our parents, who finally came to her aid. After that night, we moved out of that house and never looked back. But the memory of what happened still haunts us to this day. We never did find out what caused those footsteps, cold spots, and tugging duvets. But we know one thing for sure: we were not alone in that house. The uninvited guest was always there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike at any moment. It was a night like any other, except for the feeling of being watched that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake off the feeling as I drove up the dirt road to my home in the hills. The closer I got to my house, the more intense the feeling became. As I parked my car, I reached for the pocket knife I kept in my glove box, just in case. I stepped out of the car and looked around, my eyes focusing on a dark patch of woods on the other side of the road. I knew someone or something was watching me. Without a second thought, I calmly held up my knife and said, "I know you're there." Suddenly, the world went dead quiet. Even the sound of the nearby waterfall was gone. I waited for a few moments, and then the silence was broken by something running away from me. I didn't want to run, but I knew I had to get to safety. I quickly walked towards my house, keeping my knife at the ready. As I entered the house, I saw that my 2 dogs were staring out of the living room window in the same direction I had felt the gaze from. I didn't want to wake up my fiancée, who was sound asleep. She didn't believe in the paranormal, but I knew that what I had just experienced was beyond any explanation. The next few days passed without any strange occurrences. I tried to put the incident out of my mind and focus on my work at the warehouse. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being followed wherever I went. It felt like someone or something was always watching me. One night, as I was leaving work, I saw a dark figure standing outside the warehouse. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I got closer, I could see that it was a person, or something that looked like a person. It had a tall, lanky frame, and its skin was pale and almost translucent. I quickly got into my car and drove away, but the figure seemed to follow me. It was as if it was tracking me, and I could feel its gaze on me. I knew that this was not a human being, but something else entirely. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of being stalked grew stronger with each passing day. I couldn't sleep, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I began to research about Native American legends and stories, hoping to find some answers. One day, I came across a story about a creature known as the Night Stalker. It was said to be a demon that took on the form of a human, with pale, translucent skin and glowing eyes that could see in the dark. It was known to stalk and prey on people, driving them to madness and death. I knew that this was what was after me. The Night Stalker had chosen me as its next victim. I didn't know how to escape from its grasp, and I knew that my time was running out. I began to prepare for the worst, stocking up on weapons and protective gear. I barricaded myself inside my home, hoping that it would keep me safe from the Night Stalker's clutches. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't leave my house. I lived in fear, never knowing when the Night Stalker would strike. However, it never came. The feeling of being watched gradually faded away, and I knew that I was finally safe. To this day, I don't know what the Night Stalker was, or why it chose me. But I know that it was real, and that it could come back at any moment. I live in fear, always looking over my shoulder, never truly feeling safe. The Night Stalker may have left me alone for now, but I know that it's out there, waiting for its next victim. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the fear that consumed me, and the knowledge that something out there is far more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural until I moved into my stepmom's house. It was a creepy feeling that I couldn't shake, like something was constantly watching me. And then, the shadow appeared. It started with a quick darting shadow, always running from the hallway into my dad's study. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but my stepmom and dad had seen it too. We all acknowledged it, and that's when the activity started picking up. One day, I was alone in my room when I heard the front door open. I heard my stepmom's voice, sounding cheerful, asking the dogs if they wanted to go outside. I came out to say hello, but no one was there. The front door was still locked, and my dogs were barking towards my dad's study. I was so scared that I asked the shadow to stop mocking us and that we weren't playing games with it. But it seemed to be just getting started. I went away for the weekend, staying at a hotel with a friend who had come to visit. The next morning, I got a call from my dad, who asked me where I was and why I left the house so early. He said that I had opened their bedroom door the previous night, told them that I was home, and then walked away and went into my room, shutting the door. I was confused because I wasn't home that night. That's when my dad lost it, and I realized that the shadow was mocking my voice now. It continued to mock us all, even to this day. We would hear whispers and footsteps, but when we investigated, no one was there. Doors would open and close on their own, and we could hear laughter coming from empty rooms. The mocking shadow was getting bolder, and we knew we had to do something. We decided to bring in a paranormal investigator who confirmed that there was a presence in the house. It wasn't a ghost, but something much darker. We learned that the shadow was a manifestation of negative energy and that it was feeding off our fear and anxiety. We had to take control of the situation and confront it. We performed a cleansing ritual using sage and holy water and demanded that the shadow leave our house. It wasn't easy, and the shadow fought back with even more intensity. But eventually, we felt a shift in the energy, and the mocking voice became fainter and fainter until it was gone. The house felt different, lighter, and more peaceful. We knew that we had taken control of the situation and banished the shadow. But we also knew that we had to be vigilant to make sure that the negative energy didn't return. The mocking shadow had taught us that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that we can't see, but that doesn't mean we can't fight them. I was just a child when I had an experience that I still can't explain to this day. It happened when my dad and I went to visit his foster family in a small city in Wisconsin. I was excited to see my uncles and aunts who were in their teens at the time, and we spent most of our time playing video games together. One night, while we were all hanging out in the living room, a storm rolled in, and my family was very conscious about the weather, so they flipped the TV to the news to check for any updates. As we watched, we heard an earth-shaking boom pop that was unlike any thunder I had ever heard. The power shut off instantly, and I saw a flash outside the window. While everyone else was concerned about getting the TV back on, I kept looking out the window and saw a floating ball of light on the city horizon. It moved and glowed, getting brighter by the second. I tried to get someone's attention, but no one was interested in listening to me. Suddenly, the ball of light disappeared, and the power came back on immediately. I couldn't shake the image of the ball of light from my mind, and I asked my dad about it. He didn't know what I was talking about and dismissed it as a product of my imagination. Years went by, and I grew up, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I started researching what I saw, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized that what I saw might not have been of this world. One day, I stumbled upon a story of a UFO sighting that occurred in the same city around the same time as my experience. Witnesses described seeing a bright ball of light that moved quickly through the sky before disappearing. The more I read about this sighting, the more I realized that what I saw was not just a coincidence. The ball of light I saw that night was not natural, and it was not of this world. It was something that I couldn't explain, and it still sends shivers down my spine to this day. Now, whenever I hear a loud boom pop during a storm, my heart races, and I can't help but wonder if the ball of light will make another appearance. I've never shared this story with anyone, but I can't help but feel like I need to tell someone, anyone, about what I saw that night. I grew up in a small town on Oak Street in a house that I believed was haunted. Strange things would happen regularly, and I never felt truly at ease there. Toys would go off, TVs would turn on and off, and things would move around on their own. But one night, something truly terrifying happened. I had just moved into my own bedroom, and I was having trouble sleeping. I couldn't get comfortable, and I had this eerie feeling. I tried to ignore it, but then I saw a tall, black figure in the shape of a man staring at me from the doorway. I froze, not wanting to make any sudden moves or let it know I had seen it. After a while, the figure disappeared, and I tried to go back to sleep. But then my little brother came into my room, looking scared and confused. He said that something had pulled him out of his bed and he saw a shadow heading towards my room. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I didn't want to scare him even more, so I didn't tell him about the figure I had seen earlier. Over the years, nothing as dramatic happened again, but the house still felt off. There were still strange noises and occurrences that couldn't be explained. It wasn't until years later, when I had moved out and was talking to my older sister, that I found out the truth. My sister had seen a ghostly figure in our house years earlier when she was still sharing a bedroom with me. She had always been too scared to tell anyone, but she finally opened up to me. She described the figure as a tall man in a black suit, just like the one I had seen that night. We did some research and found out that a man had died in our house many years ago under mysterious circumstances. It was believed that he had been murdered, and his body was never found. The more we dug into the history of our house, the more we uncovered. It was like the ghost had been trying to communicate with us all along, but we had never realized it. We eventually moved out of that house, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched and the strange occurrences that we experienced there. It's a feeling that has stayed with me, and I'll never forget the haunted house on Oak Street. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. That is, until that one fateful night in Reno. My boyfriend, now husband, and I were looking to escape the monotony of our small town for a night of fun and excitement. We checked into our hotel, and the night was a blur of gambling, partying, and pills. We stumbled back to our room in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and ready for some sleep. But as I lay there, the sandpaper sheets scratching against my skin, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. In the corner of the room where the wall met the window, there was a tall, black figure. At first, I thought it was just the curtains blowing in the wind, but the figure was too dark, too solid. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, chalking it up to the drugs and alcohol. Fast forward 6 months, and I was 6 months pregnant with our son. We were watching a top 10 scary ghost sightings video on YouTube when I brought up that night in Reno. I finally mustered up the courage to tell my husband what I saw, and to my shock, he had seen it too. He had tried to wake me up, but I was too far gone in my pill-induced slumber. He described the figure in the same way I had seen it, tall, dark, and looming in the corner of the room. We both tried to shake it off, but it lingered in our minds. We couldn't explain it away as a trick of the light or a figment of our imaginations. It was as if something had been watching us that night, lurking in the shadows. After our son was born, we didn't talk about it much. Life got in the way, and we were busy with our new family. But every time we passed through Reno, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Years later, we were watching a documentary about haunted hotels, and to our surprise, the hotel we had stayed in was mentioned. Apparently, there had been reports of a shadowy figure in that same corner of the room we had stayed in. That's when we knew it wasn't just our minds playing tricks on us. Something had been there with us that night, and it still sends shivers down my spine to this day. It was Christmas time, and my family and I had rented a hostel by the seaside. We were all excited to spend the holidays together, but little did we know that our innocent curiosity would lead us down a path of terror and despair. One night, while we were all gathered at the local pub, my uncle overheard some locals talking about a dead whale that had washed up on the beach. They were planning on blowing it up to get rid of it. The thought of witnessing such a spectacle intrigued us all, and we made plans to head down to the beach the next day. When we arrived at the beach, the stench of rotting flesh hit us hard. The beach was littered with bits of dead whale, and the smell was overwhelming. We couldn't help but gag as we walked closer to the carcass. My mom, being the curious one, decided to kick a piece of whale blubber that was lying around. To our horror, the blubber exploded and splattered all over me. I was covered in dead whale from head to toe, and the smell was unbearable. We quickly headed back to the hostel, but the smell lingered on my clothes and in my hair. I had to throw away my trainers and borrow cagoule in a public bin because no one could stand to be near me. But that was just the beginning of our nightmare. As the days went by, strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, we would hear whispers in the night, and there was a constant feeling of being watched. At first, we brushed it off as our imaginations playing tricks on us. But as the days went by, the occurrences became more frequent and intense. One night, my cousin woke up to find a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. He screamed and woke us all up, but by the time we got to his room, the figure had disappeared. That's when we started to realize that something was not right. We tried to leave the hostel, but every time we packed up our things and headed for the door, we would hear a loud banging noise, as if someone was trying to keep us from leaving. We were trapped. Trapped in a hostel that was cursed by the dead whale that had washed up on the beach. We soon realized that the whale had been a sacred creature to the local fishermen, and by blowing it up, we had angered the spirits that protected their village. We spent the rest of the holiday season in fear, constantly being tormented by the vengeful spirits that haunted the hostel. It wasn't until we apologized to the fishermen and made a sacrificial offering of fish to the sea that the spirits finally let us go. But the memory of that cursed hostel still haunts me to this day. The curse of the whale blubber is a warning to all those who dare to disrespect the natural world.